Alright, so here you can see the materials that I used to create a authentic English trade knife. I have a piece of 1095 high carbon tool steel here, which is correct for this type of knife. This particular one is 3/32 of an inch thick, 2 inches wide, and 18 inches long. This is enough to get several trade knives out of. I have my pattern here that I trace on the steel to cut it out. Historically, cutting out or shearing out the rough form of the trade knife or scalping knife was done. The image of the lone solitary craftsman carefully forging out a knife wasn't done with these. Again, it was quick production and a quick profit turnaround. There was a little bit of forging involved on these, but not a whole lot. We have a piece of beech here, 3/4 of an inch thick. This is about 4.5 inches long. Beech was one of the woods that these were commonly handled in, and the pins that I knocked off there, these are small 4D finish nails. That's about the right size to copy an original pin in the diameter, and these are about 1.5 inches long. We'll end up cutting some of this off as we go. The pattern that I have here, which is an old section of steel, it's undersized because when we forge this out, forge the bevels in and taper the tang, obviously it's going to change some. It's approximately from tip to the end about 6 7/8 inch long, which is going to give us a trade knife that will be about 7 inches. The width on the back section here is about 1 inch, and the tang section here is about 2 3/8 of an inch long, and that's the rough dimensions that will give us the desired thickness when we forge it and finish it out. So that's basically all you need to create an authentic English trade or scalping knife as far as the materials go. So the first thing to do is to go ahead and get this pattern traced on the blade, which I typically just use a magic marker for that, and get it mounted up in the vise, and we'll cut it out with an angle grinder. Okay, so I have my pattern traced on there, and I have this mounted in my bench vise. If you're careful, you will have enough room on a 2-inch wide section of steel to get 2 blades. There's enough room to fit another one in here, and if you're very careful and split the difference going down the cutting edge, you can get 2 knives. So I'll go ahead and get my angle grinder with a cutoff wheel set up, and we'll profile this shape out. Alright, so I've got our basic profile cut out now. I'm going to jump around me on my bench grinder, just clean this profile up a little bit. We'll get the forge lit and proceed to taper out the tang and forge in our bevels. Okay, so I have my forge fire going here. I have the tang of the knife inserted in first. I'm going to taper that out. The tangs on English trade or scalping knives historically were tapered out heading this way and flaring this way to a very thin rearward portion, almost paper thin. You do want to be careful when you're forging the tang, especially with 1095 as it has a high carbon content, to not forge it beyond a dull orange color. When it hits dull orange, stop hammering on it, because as you compact that steel while it's cold, it will become so dense you will not be able to drill holes in it for your pins. I've had it happen several times, so something to be aware of. And then also we're going to be stretching the knife this way a bit, starting thick at the rearward portion where the blade meets the tang, and then gradually thinning it down its length. Some call that a distal taper. And then on the width, we'll be pulling the cutting edge downward to create where we're going to come together as sharp. So the steel is pretty thin, 3/32 of an inch. This is not going to be an in-depth forging video. I have other videos available if you want to see how I do that. I'm just going to show you the basics. So we're going to start with thinning down the tang and go from there. Okay, so right about there is where you want to stop. You don't want to take it any cooler, or you'll compact that grain and have trouble drilling holes later on. Alright, so I've got this tang tapered down pretty much where it needs to be, both on the cross section and pulling it back this way. It's thinning down as it goes this way, and it's also gently flaring out. So now I'm going to focus on the cutting edge, start forging in that bevel. English trade knives, to state the obvious, do have an upward curve or flare. It will become accentuated while you are forging this in, so you may have to straighten the blade occasionally to keep it from overdoing itself, but a nice gentle curve is always associated with the English variety. So we'll forge in the cutting edge and taper on this blade next. Just kind of gently working the cutting edge, pulling it down, and then also gently tapering that toward the tip. Alright, so here we have our finished profile that we forged in. It can be a bit of a challenge when working with thin steel like this to keep everything straight, but you can do it. Also, hammer gently. You don't have to hit it for all it's worth to forge those bevels in. You can tell the upward slope is very gentle. Historically, that's the way most of them were. No two were alike, but some trade knives that you see nowadays have the upward sweep overdone, in my opinion. It's quite drastic, and most of the originals that you find, it was relatively gentle, more along the lines. With knife steel this thin, you could have just went straight into grinding without bothering to forge in the tapers. However, historically it's believed that they were forged in an effort to save steel. In other words, if I made this steel to go straight to grinding, I would have had to use more of it, whereas I can get away with less and stretch the steel out both in the width and the length and save material, which is important if you're doing, hundreds of these a day, because that's going to affect your bottom line. So that's the way I do it, as it's believed that's the way it was done historically. The next step, I will normalize this blade, which is simply heating it up to a dull orange several times and letting it cool in the air to relieve stress, and then we'll go into the grinding and filing to refine the shape and put our final bevels in. Historically, that was typically done on water-cooled grinding stones that were driven by water power or hydropower. And they were very large affairs. They were about 6 feet tall and would do an efficient job at grinding the steel away, even though they were powered by water. So we're going to cheat a little bit and use electricity, but that is the next step. Okay, so I have my profile cleaned up to about how I want it to be. Our dimensions are about where they need to be. The other thing that I'm going to do is put my maker's mark on this. Now, historically, for whatever reason, and there's been various theories talked about why it was done, when you stamp a maker's mark, it's going to be on the opposite side of the blade. So in other words, I'm holding this in my left hand with the tip facing to the right. The maker's mark will generally be on the reverse side. Some people have speculated and said that at a dinner setting where fine cutlery was laid out, the cutting edge was typically facing to the right, and it was bad etiquette to have the maker's mark showing, so it was on the bottom. We'll probably never know, but for whatever reason, as you're holding it, it will be on the underside. So I'm going to stamp the maker's mark in it and then get on to the next step. Alright, so our basic profile is done, and whilst I am coming up with stuff to do in between thermocycling this blade, I'm going to go ahead and trace out our handle. It's very easy to do. You want to make sure you have this portion here shaped, of course, the way you want it, but I just put that slightly below the top edge on our block of wood. Make sure you don't have any cracks or voids or anything on the wood where you're striking your lines out. Just come down on one side, come down on the other, and I usually will put just a little arrow designating that that is the blade side, and then just take a straight edge and run those lines all the way to the end, and then you have a basic outline of your handle. Okay, so with the knife chucked up in the vise with a supporting board and a C-clamp, I'm going to take my large angle grinder with a flat grinding blade on it and just clean off some of this forged scale, establish our bevel a little bit, and do the same thing to the tang on each side. You want to be careful and not overdo it again because the blade is so thin, and I don't do this to finish thickness. I will switch over to use my bench sander, but this is what I do to save wear and tear on the belts and get the basic edge cutting profile established. Okay, so I've got everything cleaned off with the angle grinder and my basic bevels established, cleaned off a lot of the forged scale, thinned the tang down, and with this thin blade it will tend to get rather hot quickly. Don't make the mistake of dunking it in water or hitting it with water. That will introduce cracks into the blade. If you heat the thing up, just let it cool down to air temperature before you do anything to it. So we'll set this aside to cool off for a few minutes. I'm going to switch over to refine it on my bench sander, and while we're waiting, I'm going to take our handle section and go ahead and remove the wood to these lines. Don't touch the cross section, just left and right, remove the wood to the line. You can use a bench sander, file, rasp, whatever you want to do to get it down there, but while that's cooling, I'll go ahead and do that. Okay, so with the handle profiled side to side, what I do now before we reduce it down any further is we're going to mark our lines for the cutout for where the tang is going to go, and I just take a set of calipers with a pencil and get my approximate center and scribe down, flip it over, do the other side, and then also we're going to do it across the top. And then you could mark out the depth of your tang and make a cross line there. And this is a saw cut we're going to make to accept the tang. Obviously you'll need to use a fairly thin hand saw as the tang is not very thick, but more on that later. We're going to get back to the blade now. That was just a little step I wanted to show you on this. I typically will make the depth cut a little longer than the tang is and have that extend up onto the blade about 1/8 inch or so. That was done on originals, and my guess is it was done to help support the thin tang. By extending the handle up onto the blade, you're going to get into some of the hardened and tempered portion of the blade, since we have a thin tang here, just to help reinforce it. So more on the handle later. We're going to jump back to the blade. Okay, so I have my bench sander here all ready to go. I'm going to profile my blade now. I'm not going to give a lot of instruction on how to do that, since I'm basically just showing the steps that make a English trade or scalping knife a scalping knife, and skipping a lot of in-depth knife making. If you want to know how to run one of these and profile a blade, there's lots of videos on YouTube that you can find. We're just going to put a simple flat grind on this blade as would have been done originally. Okay, so I've got this blade pretty much profiled how I want it to be, and now I'm going to take a file and draw file this blade to get it close to finish, but not quite, because still we have to heat treat this blade. And if you're not familiar with draw filing, it's simply you place the file like so and push it along. I usually start at the tip, about halfway back, and work it and work the other side, getting my tapers even on both sides, both in relation to the blade and the tip. I'm not going to film it. If you want to see that again, there's lots of videos online that go into depth. It's just how I like to finish my blades out. I think it makes a big difference in leveling them and so forth, so that step's next. Okay, so we have the blade all profiled and filed out both ways. I've got all the scale and whatnot removed, a nice taper going on it both ways. That's another misconception, that a trade knife should be, you know, a big burly heavy mountain man crude kind of a knife with forged scale all over it and hammer marks, and that wasn't the case. These were very well refined back in the day. So we'll get set up now to start the handle. Okay, so as we showed earlier, we have our center line ready to go, and I made a little depth cut mark how deep I want it to go. I'm going to start this cut with a hacksaw and just try and keep it on both sides of the line all the way down, and then we're going to switch over and using a small belt sander that I can get in here, we're going to finish widening this out so it fits the tang of our knife. But to start, we're just going to simply use our hacksaw and try to keep it on the line. Okay, so we have our line cut in our piece of wood. Next, I'm going to take a little 1x42 belt sander that I can actually stick that groove into the sanding belt and slowly work it in. Obviously, you want to be careful not to twist it to keep it straight. You can do this with hand tools. It just takes a lot longer. I do this for the sake of speed. And if you're careful, you can get a real nice shape to fit your corresponding tang. So real gently and easy. Okay, so we have a good fit going now on our tang slot in our handle. What I'll go ahead and do now is put the little bevels on the handle just so I can tell how far back from the handle to place the pin. So I'll typically just stick the handle on the sander, holding it at an angle like so, put those in there until I'm about a 1/16 of an inch off from that. So that next. Okay, so I have our bevels here on our handle just crudely established, and from that now we can shoot a center line down this and establish where our pins are going to go. Now most English trade knives utilize 3 pins, sometimes 2, more commonly 3 though. I typically try and get them, of course, evenly spaced, but truth be told, on many originals it looks like they did it very haphazardly and just eyeballed them, and you'll see them bunched up off center. So you can really do this by eye if you want to, and that's just fine coming out crude, or you can take the time to precisely line them up, which is what I typically try to do. So you're going to have your 3 pins and center them and space them as nicely as you feel inclined to do. So that's next. Okay, so I have our 3 holes lined up here. I'm going to use a 5/64 drill bit. It's going to give us about the right hole. That's why we kept this block flat. We haven't contoured or done anything with that so that it's lined square on the table here. So I'm going to drill through the wood and mark the tang, and then remove the knife from the handle and go ahead and drill through the rest of the way, and then put the block back on and drill through that way. So that's up next. Make sure I got it lined up. Go down and just mark the steel. Okay, I don't know if you can see that or not. We have just a teeny tiny little mark right there that I'll clamp this on the drill press and drill our hole through. Okay, so I've drilled through our tang and clear through on the first top pin, both sides. The reason I didn't have that in place and drill straight through the whole thing is that after you go through this top layer of wood into your tang, it can throw the bit off and you can get a real bad alignment on the other side. So that's why I put it in place, drill down through the top part of the handle, mark the blade, pull it out, drill through the rest of the way. Then I will set this squarely back on the table, and without the blade in it, go ahead and drill through. Putting that all in there now, we should hit our first pin all through those 3 layers with no problem. I'll put the pin in place and then drop back and do the next hole the same exact way, get that all fit, and then do the last one in the same fashion. Okay, so I got our pins all in. Hopefully you got everything lined up good, fitting good if you're following along. I don't know if you can see, but I have some small layout lines here that's going to allow me to taper this a bit, starting wide here and gently tapering down as we go forward. There's different facets that you can do on trade knife handles. This one is just going to be an oval facet, which is basically just rounding it and contouring it over after I get these lines established. But I'm going to do that work on the belt sander, and that's up next. Alright, so that's got our basic oval shape that I was going for on this one. I've shortened the bottom a little bit. I'm going to get this one down around 4 3/8. And we are now ready to heat treat our blade. I'm not going to show that process because that just falls under general knife making. There's no special way trade knife blades were heat treated. So after I do that, I'll show you how to finish out the blade, fit it up to the handle, and get ready for our final fit and finish. Okay guys, I've got our blade heat treated at this point. I'll clean up the way I want it. I have it dry fit to the handle. Now's the time obviously to do that before we permanently attach it. I have taken the pins and formed little rivet heads on one side. See, they're left along on the other. Pretty small. Again, originally they were that size. Great big giant cutler type rivets were not used on these knives. The finish I have on this blade, I've taken it to 150 grit, and that is about the maximum they would do. Many believe that these were finished out on the wet grinding stones that they used, and the finish some think would be more appropriate if it went in this direction horizontally. I do mine this away vertically. I just think it looks a little better, but 150 grit is as fine a finish as these would have. I typically will antique my blades, but if you're not going to, that's where you want to stop. And you can put epoxy if you want, 2-part epoxy down in on the tang before you install these rivets if you want. Historically, the handle was usually left just a little proud this way and out this way, and it was filled with what called cutler's resin, which is a mix of pine resin and brick dust. It'd be filled in there and then sanded off again in order to produce an item quickly. Wasn't a lot of fine finish. I shoot for something just a little better than that and get mine flush, but historically that is an option. So I'm going to go ahead and get things tuned just a little bit on this knife, and then go ahead and set the tang down in there, use a little bit of epoxy, and when that's dry, cut these rivets off, peen it on each side. We can sand our handle down and we'll have a finished trade knife. So that's coming up next. Alright, so I've got our blade glued in place. I've cut the rivets off, and I've only got about a 1/16 of an inch sticking up through the top here. You don't need a massive amount, just a little bit to peen and get a nice. After we get them peened down tight, this knife is ready to finish on out. You can sand your handle down then, put whatever stain and finish you want on it. Historically, when these were finished, they would have just been shipped that way. No stain on the handle, no antiquing or etching on the blade, and then the new owner at the trading post or Ford could paint, stain, just use whatever they wanted to do with the knife just like that. But I will probably go ahead and stain and finish this knife as I oftentimes do, but first we'll go ahead and get these rivets peened. Alright, so I've got our handle all sanded out. You can see the shape of the handle is an oval now, one of 3 facets that you can do that originals carried. And again, originally these knives were not finished or stained. That'd be up to whomever purchased the knife to take care of that, but people generally don't like a brand new shiny knife, so we're gonna dull this on down on the handle. Got some walnut hull stain here that I'm going to use, and this will give it a nice antique brownish yellow color. And I will probably do 2 or 3 coats of this because it's a fairly weak stain. And then we'll throw some varnish on it after that, antique the blade, sharpen it up, and we'll call it done. So continuing on. Alright guys, so we have our finished trade knife here. We got several good coats of varnish on the handle. I've gently antiqued the blade. We've got a 7-inch blade here with a 4 3/8 inch long beechwood handle, 3 iron rivets, oval cross section, and now we have an authentic blade that is ready for the display or field use. Thanks so much for tuning in once again, everybody. We appreciate it, and we'll see you next time. Bye now.